time. One of my favorite poets is Rumi. What an amazing man, beautiful man. Rumi makes this statement. He says, what strange beings we are. But he goes on to say that sitting in hell at the bottom of the dark, we're afraid of our own immortality. Isn't it a powerful thing to say? And I thought about this, and I think there's probably a lot of truth to what he's saying, and perhaps it may be even more than that. In addition to maybe being afraid of our own immortality, my sense from traveling the world over the last 20 years is what really frightens us the most is that we know we have the ability to heal the hell that we find ourselves in. And I think knowing that we have that power within us scares us in ways maybe that we're only beginning to understand. How many believe there's a power within you that's untapped? You have not used your fullest potential. I believe that as well. And my question is, why aren't we using it? If we were ever going to bring that power to bear on the world, doesn't today seem like a really good time to do it? You look at what's happening in the world. I've had some feedback from some members of the religious community about some of the material that I've been sharing over the last 20 years, because much of what I'm sharing now was part of our literature in our pre-biblical and early biblical texts, and it was edited right out in the 4th century, in the year 324, 325 AD, 1700 years ago, because at that time the church believed that we were not capable of dealing with the power that those words elicited from our hearts. And what those people are saying to me today, they're saying, Gregg, there's a reason why this information was edited out 1700 years ago. What gives you the right to share it today? And my feeling is if we're ever going to do the things that we know we can do, what better time than today? Because for the first time in all of recorded human history, we have at our fingertips the power to destroy everything that we cherish as a civilization. And we also have the power to preserve all that we love and cherish and hold dear. So maybe it's the power to heal the hell, our personal hell, our collective hell, that really frightens us, that Rumi's talking about. We talked about the new discoveries in the world of science, specifically quantum physics, that tell us that maybe we work very differently in this world than we've ever believed. It changes everything about who we believe we are. The bottom line is, number one, that there is now an intelligent field of energy that is called the divine matrix. Western science now acknowledges this field is here. It's no longer hypothetical. It's not airy-fairy. It's not New Age wishful thinking. Although the spiritual and the indigenous traditions have told us that we're united for over 5,000 years, Western science is now on board. Western science has now arrived at the place where those ancient traditions have always begun, with the fact that we are united through this field of energy. Number two, the discoveries show that the stuff we're made of, the stuff of our world, literally is a materialization in visible form of the invisible stuff that is in this field of the divine matrix. In other words, this field contains the blueprint for all possibilities. They are a potential. For you engineers out there, they are scalar. And it is the power of emotion and belief that translates that potential into something real in our world and real in our lives. For you engineers, something vector. So we're talking about scalar and vector potential, or what is invisible and what is visible. The question is, now that we know these things exist, how much power do we really have in our lives? How much power do we have to change our lives, or to change our bodies, or to change our world within the context of everything that we're now knowing to be true? So these new discoveries suggest that this power to change is based in our belief of what is real within this divine matrix. It's based in what we believe to be true, because our beliefs are what's translating these possibilities into the reality of the world. Remember back in the old days when you were in school, probably, and when I was in school, and we were taking physics, and physics and the atoms were about things called protons, electrons, neutrons. Remember? We thought it was a big deal and complex then. It's simple compared to where we are now. We had the mechanical view of the atom that looks something like this, like a little solar system. We now know that our world doesn't work that way, that what we call our reality looks like this. There's nothing there. It's all potential. It is a potential of waves. It is a pattern of energy that is vibrating. When it vibrates really slow, it gets real dense. When it vibrates fast, it gets very ethereal. Our world, our bodies, are made of this stuff, regulated by our beliefs and by our consciousness. So now we've got to ask ourselves, how real is reality? We've been exploring this for the last 5,000 years, and even recently, in the 20th century, we've had programs helping us to explore these. Any Outer Limits fans or Twilight Zone fans here? One of the most powerful episodes that I saw when I was 10, 11 years old, when this first episode was when the old black and white episodes came out. World War II, there's a couple of fighter pilots. They're in a plane, and the plane has been hit. And the way this particular plane works, it's got a glass canopy underneath where a man sits all by himself. He's got a 360-degree view, and he can tell the pilot when enemy fighters are coming up. This plane is hit, and they're going to have to land. And as the pilot makes the arrangements and everything he does to have to land, what they realize is they're on their way to their final approach is that there's no landing gear left on the plane. And he's got a choice. He is either going to land and save the crew, but he's going to kill his friend who's in that glass canopy underneath. Or they're going to try to ditch it in the ocean and maybe lose everybody. It's a powerful episode. And what happens is he has to make this decision, and you see most of the program is the pilot's turmoil. He's wrenching inside, knowing he's about to kill his friend, and he says, I've got to do this. This is what I have to do. He takes the plane in for a landing, and all of a sudden, something happens. And this is what the whole story is all about. The camera zooms in. The man on the canopy knows the same thing. He knows his friend, the pilot, has to make this choice, and there's not much he can do. And he reaches into his backpack and pulls out a sketch pad. And I thought, now that's interesting. And he sketches a picture of the plane, and underneath the plane, he sketches some landing gear and some tires. And these aren't plain old tires. These look like big Donald Duck cartoon tires, like big, round, puffy donuts. All of a sudden, the pilot lands this plane. He's on the runway. He's expecting this to come to a skidding stop, and he realizes that he's got landing gear, and he can't figure out why. The plane stops, they all jump out, and they turn around and look, and they see their friend getting out of this canopy underneath. And he's in a daze, and he's got his sketch pad. And as he walks towards his friends, that plane is sitting there, and these big, fat, donut-like tires are sitting there holding it up. And as they hug each other and look back to the plane, the man that did the drawing awakens from his trance. Those tires disappear, the plane drops onto the tarmac and bursts into flames. And they just cry in disbelief. What a powerful story. Now, that was a make-believe story, but it's important. It's a fictional story because it reminds us that the very experience of belief that you and I have been conditioned to discount since we were children is precisely the power that the ancient indigenous people told us, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is the single most powerful force in the world, in the universe. And now Western physics is beginning to find the same thing. You're going to see this. We're going to see the experiments that show how and the quality of what we believe determines what's happening in our world. It determines that. That was a fictional story, but we have all heard about stories that are not so fictional. There was a story a couple of years ago. A woman in the Midwest, upper Midwest, was walking down the street. All of a sudden, she saw a car slip out of gear on a hill from beside a road, rolled down a hill, and struck a young boy who was standing at a street corner waiting for a bus, and the car stopped. And this woman walked over to that car, and she picked up the back end of the car and held it up so this boy would live until rescuers could get underneath, pull the boy out. He was unconscious. Then she got into the ambulance and rode with him to the hospital and was in the emergency waiting room. And the doctor came out and said, this boy is going to be just fine thanks to you picking that car up so he could get out from underneath it. She was in an altered state. She was in a trance. When she heard the doctor tell her what she had done, she passed out and collapsed because it was more than her belief system could sustain. The fact that it happened means that it's possible. What is it within us? What is within us that allows us to perform these miraculous feats beyond our potential? And why does it only happen at those special times? Why don't we do it all the time? The question that we're asking is, who are we? Who are we, these mysterious beings that Rumi talks about? These strange, powerful, mystical, mysterious beings. Are we truly passive observers in the universe? Are we just passing through a moment in time late in the development of this universe with very little effect on the world around us? Or, as many physicists are beginning to say, and as our ancient and indigenous predecessors told us, are we powerful creators actually creating this universe as we go? There are physicists today, particularly Dr. John Wheeler of Princeton University, who is literally saying that the universe exists because of consciousness. Maybe not yours and mine today, but because of consciousness in general. And that our consciousness today is continuing to add to and change and evolve the universe. And this is precisely what our most cherished traditions have said to us, that we're part of everything that we see. We have direct access to the most fundamental creative forces in this universe that gives us the power to heal our bodies, to heal the bodies of our loved ones, to bring peace to our world, abundance into our lives, because that is our ability to do precisely these things. It's all about quantum energy, the stuff that we're made of. We now know that quantum energy is directly affected by belief. Belief! What physicists now know is that quantum energy is directly affected by the power of belief. Belief is literally a code. You all are programmers. You're physicists. You have to be to live in this world. You also have to be a little nutty to live in this world. You think so? I was just having this conversation with a woman on the plane on the way out here, because an absolutely sane, rational person probably could not sustain the hurt of all the things that are happening in this world today. So we're all a little out there. We have to be just to get by, but we can have fun with it. Belief is a code. Belief is what translates the invisible potential. What physicists are saying is that the blueprint for everything you could ever imagine already exists. All of the peace, all of the healing, all of the abundance, all of the joy, as well as the darkness and the Holocaust and the war and the death and the suffering and destruction, they all exist as potential in this quantum field. And it's where we place our focus that locks one of those possibilities into place and brings it into this material world. You're going to see exactly how it happens. The code that translates the invisible energy into what we see as the visible matter. A growing number of scientists, mainstream scientists, are now saying that our universe and our reality works like a giant, massive consciousness computer. I was a senior computer systems designer at Martin Marietta Aerospace, and when I saw this, I said, cool. Tell me more. Most of us are familiar enough with computers now that we can use this as an analogy. So I chose to use it here today. A computer, any computer, no matter how small or how big, pretty much operates the same way. All computers have what are called hardware. It's your keyboards. It's your screen. It's where the output from your computer is seen on a printer or a plotter of some kind. We have what is called an operating system. Sometimes it's a Macintosh or a Windows or a Unix or a Sun operating system. And we have programs. The programs speak to the hardware through the operating system. The operating system is the intermediary that allows our programs, Word, Mac, Picture, whatever it is, to talk to the hardware. Let's compare our electronic computer to our consciousness computer. An electronic computer has hardware or the output. Our consciousness computer of the universe has hardware or output that we call the physical world. An electronic computer, as we just said, has an operating system. Consciousness has an operating system that is called consciousness. An electronic computer has programs that speak through the operating system to change the output. Our consciousness computer also has programs that speak through the consciousness to change our physical world. What do we call those programs? We call it feeling and belief. What we believe and how we feel about what we believe. How many people have heard it say we've got to change our consciousness? You hear that all the time. I had a phone call a few weeks ago. They said, Greg, you have to come to this little town outside of Chicago because the forces of darkness are taking over and doing all these programs. We need you to come do a program of light to change the consciousness. Okay, I understand it's well-intentioned. I know what it means. But look at what's happening here. If you want to change what's happening. For all intents and purposes, on your program, if you want to change what comes out of your computer, do you change your operating system? So for all intents and purposes, the operating system is fixed. It doesn't change. What changes is the programs that go into the operating system that are communicating. Well, if we're using this analogy and this metaphor, if we want to change our world, if we want to heal our bodies, bring peace to our world, abundance in our lives, nurturing, compassionate relationships, it's not about changing the consciousness, because our consciousness is essentially fixed. It's about changing what goes into the consciousness. If we want to change in the output on the computer, we're changing the programs. If we want to change our physical world, we've got to change our beliefs and our feelings. The way to do that was the subject of ancient traditions. Entire libraries, temple walls, and texts were left to us for over 8,000 years, telling us precisely how we do just this. And over time, bits and pieces of that have been lost in the language of spirituality. Edits were made, translations were made. Western physics, modern science, is only about 400 years old, however, and they are rediscovering in a language that they are comfortable with precisely the same principles. Reality is a code. It is literally a code. The title of this program is Rewriting the Reality Code, because that is precisely what you and I are doing, individually and collectively, a code that is based on belief. How many of you are familiar with the cold fusion experiments back in the 1980s? Remember hearing about cold fusion? It was a big deal all over the news. It was the answer to our energy problems of the 70s that we had. It put out more energy than it took to create that energy, and all of a sudden we didn't hear about it anymore. What happened? Where's cold fusion today? Well, here's what happened. What the scientists found was they could use the same equipment in the same laboratory, and sometimes that equipment would create cold fusion, and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes the experiments were successful, sometimes they were not, and they couldn't figure out why. And it took a particularly astute young physicist at the University of Colorado in Boulder, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon over a chicken salad sandwich, I would imagine. And he said, you guys, I don't know if this is important or not, but I've noticed a pattern. He said, why is it more often than not, when the scientists in the room believe in cold fusion, the experiments are successful? And when they are skeptical, the experiments fail. And this led to a whole series of studies that are still going on today. The bottom line, they discovered that the expectation of the people in the room was influencing the outcome of the experiment. Well, you can't have a global energy system based on something that people believe in. I've thought about this. I wouldn't want to be flying in a plane with a pilot who was questioning whether or not the cold fusion flying his plane was making it work or not. This is how we're going about finding out this power of belief in our lives. There are sects of Buddhism that literally say the reality of our world exists only where our mind creates a focus. There was an experiment launched in 1909 that began the whole field of quantum physics, and we're still talking about this today. What they did in 1909 was they took a particle, a quantum particle, the stuff our world is made of, a photon or an electron, and they shot that particle into a target that could determine whether or not the particle was still a particle when it got there, or if something else happened. And the only catch to this experiment was that the particle had to go through a barrier that had an opening. Well, this part of the experiment was done early in the morning, and it was an easy part of the experiment. The particle begins as a particle, it goes through that opening, it ends as a particle. Right now the particle is acting just like a particle, and everybody's really happy and very comfortable with all of their theories and their formulas. Okay, sometime after lunch they did this experiment again. Here's what happened. Everything is the same. They're using the same kind of particle, the same kind of a target. This time, however, the barrier has two openings. Now, this is a physical particle, this quantum particle. So the thinking is it's got to either go through this opening or this opening, right? Something mysterious happens, and that mystery is the mystery that is still being talked about in quantum physics today. Here's what happens. The particle leaves it a particle and it disappears. Where did that particle go? Okay, but what happened next is mind-boggling, because somehow the particle knew, if a particle can know, that two openings were available, and rather than staying as a particle and going through one or another, it accommodated both openings. It showed up twice at the target, but it's not a particle. It's a wave. It has transformed itself from a particle to a wave so that it accommodates both of those openings. The particle begins as a particle, as matter. It ends up as a wave, as energy. It begins as a visible form of matter. It ends up as an invisible form of energy. And this is where the scientists started to have a bad day. Because it messed up everything. And the question that they asked is why? Why did this happen? What is it that caused this to happen? The question is, and here's a little clue, who knows that those two openings are possible? Who knows that that particle has a choice in terms of where it goes? Okay, the particle knows, and the scientists in the room, and they said, my God, does the fact that we know those particles exist influence what's happening with the experiment? And the answer is yes. And this is what is so bizarre about where quantum physics is today. The observer knows. What physicists are now beginning to understand is there's no such thing as an observer. It's impossible for you and I to sit and observe the world. If you're looking at something and your attention and your awareness are focused on that something, you are creating, whether you're aware of your creation or not, you are creating something. It's the quality of your attention and your awareness while you are focused. This is a direct quote from John Wheeler, a contemporary of Albert Einstein's. Listen to what he says about this experiment. He says, quote, "We had this old idea that there's a universe out there, and here is man, the observer, safely protected from the universe by what he calls a 6-inch slab of plate glass." Says so that we can't touch that universe. However, he says, now we learn that to even observe an electron, we have to shatter that plate glass, so the old word observer has to be crossed off the books. There is no observer. He said we must put in the new word participator. It means that the act of us, conscious and aware, looking at the world around us, is an act of creation unto itself. It's not about control. It's not about manipulation. This is the beautiful word, participator. You and I are participating in the outcome of our world. Well, that experiment that was done in 1909 was performed again in 1998. And this time they had better equipment. And they could do the measurements even better. And what they found is so beautiful. This was done in 1998. Researchers at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, they conducted a highly controlled experiment demonstrating, again, how electrons are affected by the act of being observed. So they validated what they found in 1909. However, they found something new. What they found is not only does the observation affect what the electron is doing, they said the experiment, quote, the experiment revealed that the greater the amount of watching, the greater the observer's influence on what takes place, which is what our spiritual traditions have always said to us in their purest form. It's where we place our focus and our intent, our heart-based focus and intent, that is having the effect on the world around us. And it can have all kinds of effects. This is the stuff that made Einstein crazy. Einstein didn't like this. He didn't like thinking that we live in a world where somehow we're influencing what's happening. He said, quote, "I like to think that the particle must have a separate reality independent of the measurements." In other words, he said, "I like to think the moon is there even if I'm not looking at it." So, if we are participating, if we are the participants, how does that participation work? How does it come about? Well, it's where we place our focus, where we place our attention. And what I'd like to do, I want to talk to you about a couple of the different theories of reality that are floating around right now. No one knows for certain. I'm going to be very clear. Scientists create hypotheses, and they work with them until they find a place where it doesn't work anymore, and then they modify them and create a new hypothesis. Over the last 70 or 80 years, what I'm about to share with you is the consensus. This is pretty much where mathematicians, physicists, and other disciplines of scientists have come to agree that all the formulas work and the theories seem to fit this idea. What they're saying is this: we live in this quantum flux of possibilities. that there's this field out there called the divine matrix, and it's in here. We're part of it. It's a living, pulsating, glimmering, shimmering essence of stuff. It is like a projector screen that is everywhere. Instead of being in front of us, it's everywhere all the time. And we are like the projectors, except we're not only the projector, we're what is projected. It's like we're artists. We're not only the artist, we're the canvas that we place the art upon. We're the brushes that put the pigment on the canvas. We are the experiencers as well as the creators of the experience. What a bizarre concept. Really bizarre concept. And what they say is in this quantum flux, everything that you could ever imagine exists as a possibility. There are many possibilities. There's possibility A, where you married your high school sweetheart. That's a possibility. There's possibility B, where you didn't marry your high school sweetheart. There's a possibility C, where you married your high school sweetheart but didn't last. There's a possibility D, where you never married your high school sweetheart, but you met at your high school reunion 40 years later and had a fling. They say all these possibilities exist as potential. And what we do is we lock into one of those potentials. This is the power of imagination. This is the power of thought. Thought in and of itself has very little power. Thought in and of itself simply is a possibility. So we think about the things in our lives, about our healing and about peace. Okay, we think about those things. They have very little power until we breathe and imbue those thoughts with the power of our emotion, our dislike for what we see, or our love for what we are seeing in our mind. And that is how we lock one of these possibilities into place. It then moves from the wave potential, the invisible scalar possibility, into the particle vector reality of our real world. You and I are creators, and this is how we do it. We're programming this consciousness computer. So, we lock that possibility into place. Now, there are different theories about how these possibilities work. They all are in general agreement that there are multiple possibilities and that our attention locks one of them into place and anchors it as a reality in our world. Does that make sense? You okay with that? So the question is, the greater the amount of watching, the greater our influence on what's going on. Where is our attention and focus in the world today? What are we being, in the West, what are we being conditioned to focus on? If where we place our attention and our focus is taking these invisible quantum possibilities and locking them into place as what's real, and our world around us is any indication of what that is, where are we being asked to place our attention today? They're telling us where to place our attention. We are bombarded in the news with all kinds of information about all the bad things happening in our world, what's happening to our environment. We're being told how scary the rest of the world is. We're being told right now, if we don't watch out, we're going to end up with a big mushroom cloud on the horizon somewhere. If these theories that now are being proven in Western physics work out the way it looks like they're working out, and our physical reality is based on where we place our attention and focus and our beliefs of those things, look at what's happening. The good news is the reverse happens and it can change in a heartbeat. We're looking at two very radical possibilities on the horizon right now. Either one of the worst, darkest times in human history, or we're all going to figure this out and heal and have one of the most beautiful 1,000 years of human history. The question is, what's it going to be? And I think we all know what we're choosing right now. Because I'm going to tell you, none of those bad things have to happen. We don't have to see a mushroom cloud in the horizon. We don't have to be inundated by a disease, because your body has a power. There's a power within each of you that those diseases can't touch. It's all based on how you feel. The key is, it's not enough to say that you believe in these things unless you embody that belief. If you simply say it and you don't embody it, you set yourself up for some really frightening experiences. I know people that had cancers and were so frightened, they were paralyzed by their cancer with fear. And they said, I'm going to beat this thing. I'm going to go the holistic route. Those were the words. They were so frightened that they couldn't really believe and trust their body, because their cancer led them to believe that their body failed them. So they did only the holistic route, and they got worse and worse, and they're no longer here today. Because it's not enough to say that you believe these things. You've got to embody them. If belief translates this invisible energy of what we feel into visible matter, then the question is, why do we die? What we know right now, what is the leading cause of adults over 65 years of old? It's called cardiovascular disease. What is that? We know that the average heart beats about 100,000 times every day. We know that our hearts pump about 6 quarts of blood through about 12,000 miles of arteries, vessels, and capillaries every 24 hours. Our heart is a very important part of our body. Okay, as an engineer, I can tell you this. When we create something, a space probe, for example, and send it to another planet where we cannot fix something on that probe if it goes wrong, the one piece that the whole mission depends on is called mission critical. And it's built to last, and if it fails, it's got backups, and if it fails, it's got backups. Our hearts are obviously very powerful, very important parts of our bodies. In engineering terms, our hearts are mission critical. Does it make any sense that they would suddenly stop after only 70 or 100 years? Something that's built so well and works so well and so efficiently. Does it make any sense to you that our hearts would suddenly stop after only 70 or 100 years? You know, the Essenes, the ancient Essenes, say that we've got 900-year bodies. 900 years. What would it be like to live 900 years? Think of all the things you could get done for 900 years. Think of what it would mean when you say, honey, I love you for the rest of my life, and you get married. For the next 800 years. Why do our hearts... When I saw these statistics, it made no sense to me whatsoever. Here's what researchers are finding. Cardiovascular disease is a catch-all for these kinds of symptoms that result from long-term fear, frustration, anxiety, disappointment. This is what people like researchers Blumenthal from Duke University have found. These all fall under the category of what we call hurt. And what the researchers now are beginning to understand is that the reason that our hearts stop working after 70 to 100 years, it appears that 70 to 100 years is about the length of time that this magnificent organ in our bodies can function in the presence of unresolved hurt before the hurt steals from us the very things that we cherish the most, our own lives. Hurt. Is it possible that hurt kills us? And this is exactly what they're finding. Unresolved hurt. I'm not saying that hurt is a bad thing. It's a gauge. It tells us where we are in the world in our belief systems because our hurts are all based upon our beliefs. Unresolved hurt is what it is, they say, that takes our lives. Now, the Essenes, the ancient Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they say the first 100 years are the toughest. But you think about this. They are. Because it may be those first 100 years, that is where we go through the hurt of losing all of the things that we cherish and that we hold dear. All the things that have been familiar to us, the people, the places, the ways of life. And for many people, it appears that hurt is so deep that they simply don't survive. Or when someone close to them leaves the world, they simply say, I don't want to be in this world without this person or without my family or without my friends. They say, if you can get through those first 100, hang in there. If you can get through those first 100 years. Now, a dear friend, Norm Shealy, he's saying that we should be on this earth at least 140 years. What I'm going to say right now is Western science has found no good reason why our bodies should fail after 70 to 100 years. What we now know is that every organ in your body and my body can reproduce the cells that makes that organ, including our brains and our hearts that we used to believe couldn't do it. Every one of our organs can reproduce the cells and heal themselves. We all have stem cells. You've got stem cells in your body right now. And they're waiting for you to direct them to the places where they can rebuild and regenerate. And they're waiting for you to send them the code of your belief, of your joy, of love, so that that cell can find its place in your bone or your heart or your muscle tissue. They're already there. You don't have to have newborn infants or zygotes for those stem cells. They happen there. They happen here. We all have stem cells. It's all based on what we're believing. If we're going to rewrite that reality code, we've got to change our beliefs. We've got to change the way that we're programming this code. Over the last, since 1986, I have spent a tremendous amount of my life researching the beliefs of cultures other than our Western culture. Because as I mentioned earlier, 1,700 years ago, the language that tells us precisely what I'm sharing with you now, it was edited right out of our text. We lost 42 books out of the Bible that would eventually become our Western canonized Christian Bible. And some of those books that were left behind were condensed. We essentially have the Reader's Digest condensed version. And a lot was lost in the translation. In our culture, it didn't happen in other cultures. My thinking was, in cultures that have been least disturbed by Western civilization, that's where we might find the essence of how we apply these principles in our lives. There's a lot of wisdom held in this part of the world. It was in this monastery where this little monk rode his bicycle 30 miles in one direction to get some keys while we waited, and 30 miles back because I said, "Do you have a secret library?" And he said, "Yes." "Wait right here," because in Tibet, time means nothing. So that he could take us into this monastery and into this library. This 3-story tall, 12-foot wide library is put there 1,500 years ago that encapsulates all the books of the Bible are in here. Because the Dead Sea Scroll material was transferred into these monasteries in the 1st century after the crucifixion. So if we'd never found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we would have found them here in these libraries. Anyway, beautiful books. Well, it was in another part of this monastery that we had the opportunity to meet with these men. And they were guarding another room. I asked about this room. I knew there was a mural here. I said, "Can we see this mural?" And they said, "No, it's not possible." There's a form of begging in Tibet when you really want something. It's not a pretty sight, but it's done in all sincerity. What you do is you bow your head. You don't even look at the person. You hold your thumbs up like this and you say the words Gucci, Gucci, Gucci. So you go Gucci, 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 Gucci. And you get a room full of 40 people asking the monks, Gucci, 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 if we can do this. And he knows we're sincere because we've come halfway around the world, 17,000 feet above sea level. We may never be there again. And he said, "Okay." So they took us down to this room. Can you see this wire running across the top? That is the wire that holds this curtain that covers this wall so that no one can see what's behind here. And so they pulled it back just for a moment. Let us take a picture. And then he says, "I have to cover it again." But I want to share with you what's here because it is very non-Tibetan-like. This is what's behind that wall. It almost looks like a Christian icon of Buddha, with a halo around Buddha. What's so powerful? This is part of a teaching that's on this whole wall. He is teaching people of every color. There are black and brown and red and yellow and even some blue people, which is interesting because of the blue people you see in the Hindu tradition on the walls in India, in the Hindu temples. All different walks of life, all traditions, every one of them has a halo, has the pranic aura, just like Buddha. And this is what our little monk said. This is the teacher. He said, but the true teacher never holds back what he's teaching. He will share it, so you never need your teacher again. Your teacher turns you loose in the world. He said what he has to say, and you are now free to live that. You don't have to come back to a true teacher again and again and again. And he said, everyone that Buddha was teaching learned to do what Buddha did. And he said, "Here, I'll show you." And I said, "So what is it that they were teaching?" And what they're teaching is precisely what we're talking about now, how to communicate with this field through the power of feeling and emotion and belief. They're saying that belief and feeling, we believe something, we have a feeling about what we believe. That feeling is based in our hearts. Feeling is important, but not just any old feeling will do. There's a quality of feeling in our hearts that heals and creates in our world very precisely, very specifically. And it's that quality of feeling that Amit Goswami, he said, we create our own reality. We do, he said, but there's a subtlety in the consciousness that creates it. He said, we do not create reality in our ordinary state, like we are right now, specifically, but in what he calls a non-ordinary state of consciousness that tells us, this is a clue as to what that state is. Rumi says, out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, he said, there's a field. He actually calls it a field. He says, I'll meet you there. He said, there's a place where right and wrong don't exist. That's where the action is. Where is this place? If you're not engaged in the rightness or the wrongness, where are you? What would you call that place? It's beyond judgment and ego. Non-judgment. And this is just what the scientists now are finding out. Judgment and ego happen in our minds, in our brains, but this place of non-judgment happens right here in our heart. Non-judgment, it's heart-based. It's feeling the feelings from our hearts as if the healing has already happened, and doing it from a place that is not based in judgment, the ancient instructions for how to transcend our judgments are really clear. 1,700 years ago, these are the instructions that were edited in the Council of Nicaea in the year 324 Common Era, 324 AD. We know that they're there because they're being recovered in scrolls and texts, just like this. This is part of the New Testament scroll that was actually found, preserved in a peat bog in Ireland when the shovel of a backhoe driver turned it over and he found this very well preserved, the original book of Songs. So, I've got a little book, it's called Secrets of the Lost Mode of Prayer, in 5 chapters that describes how to transcend judgment and ego in this kind of creation. What I would like to do is go into a portion of that. Part of one of the edits. Here's one of those edits. How many of you ever heard ask and ye shall receive? You all heard that before? I've had people say, man, I ask and ask and ask, and I never receive. I've asked for a Camaro in the garage, a pile of gold in the living room, and nothing's ever happened. How come? Well, not that it's about gold in the Camaro, but this may give us some ideas of what's happening. What I'd like to do is share with you the original, as you and I are seeing it today, the original translation, and then we'll go back before the translations happened. So when we look today, you can either look at this in the King James Version of John 16:23-24. The translation that we get today says, quote, whatsoever ye ask the Father in my name, he'll give it to you. Hitherto have ye asked nothing in my name. So it's saying that we haven't even asked. Even if you think you asked, you haven't asked. The next piece of this simply says, ask and you shall receive, that your joy may be full. They cut out the good stuff. The juicy 2 sentences that tell us how to do this were edited right out of the text 1,700 years ago. This is from the Aramaic, the original Aramaic. This translation comes from Neil Douglas Clotes. There are other translators who have done very similar languages. It's very similar. And here's what it says. Quote, all things that you ask straightly, directly from inside my name, you'll be given. So far, you've not done this. So right here, it looks quite a bit like the first translations. We still haven't asked, is what it's saying. Here's the next piece. Look at this. It says, quote, ask without hidden motive and be surrounded by your answer. Be enveloped by what you desire, that your gladness be full. That's the piece that was missing. What are they saying? What is the piece without hidden motive? That's where we go, where we have no ego and no judgment, no attachment to the rightness or the wrongness or the outcome. Ask without hidden motive. Don't ask for it to be present. Come from the place that's already there. Be is not asking. Be means it's already here. Be surrounded by the things that you're choosing. Be surrounded by your joy. Be surrounded by your healing, by the peace that's already there. Feel the feelings as if those things have already happened. Be enveloped by what you desire. Now what physicists are telling us is this is the quality of belief that speaks to that field of energy, to the divine matrix. You got to give it something to work with. If it's going to mirror back to you what you've created in your heart, you've got to give it something to mirror back. Where did we learn to feel only the things that we fear and what we don't have? Where did we learn to feel the horror of looking at the checkbook at the end of the month and seeing no mortgage money there, rather than feeling the abundance of what we know is true in our lives? Where did we learn to do that? Where did we learn to stop trusting the wisdom of our bodies to heal and become so frightened that we think we've got to run to someone else, like a pharmaceutical company, to heal our bodies? Pharmaceutical companies, they do some good things. I'm not down on pharmaceutical companies. I'm saying I think to a large extent they've encouraged us to come to rely upon them. Remember years ago you never used to see commercials for drugs on TV? Now it's hard not to. And some of the drugs, I still don't know what they do. They have the commercials, I don't really know what they do, but I know the side effects can be really bad. I think, why in the world would I want this, whatever this thing is? Because, nosebleeds, diarrhea, vomiting, other than that. Yeah, ask your doctor. This is the piece that was lost out of that text. And if that sounds too religious, the teacher and philosopher Neville, early in the century, said precisely the same thing. He said, you must make your future dream a present fact by assuming the feeling of your wish fulfilled, assuming the feeling as if the outcome has already happened. When you ask for something to happen, what have you just implied? Honestly, have you ever thought about this? Even well-intentioned, when you say, dear God, please, let there be healing in the bodies of my loved ones, or let there be peace in the world, you may actually be supporting the very thing you'd like to change. Because when you say, please let it be here, you're telling the field, you're telling that divine matrix or God, however, whatever language you like, you're telling that it's not there now, and that's what's being mirrored back to us. What happens when hundreds of thousands of people get together and pray for peace? What do you think happens? I don't know. We've done it a number of times, and we see what's happening in the world now. It might be interesting to get hundreds of thousands of people together and feel the feeling as if peace is already there. It was done during the Lebanese-Israeli war in the early 1980s. Researchers went over, were trained to feel the feeling of peace in their hearts. They were positioned throughout the war-torn areas in Lebanon and Israel. And during the windows of time when they were feeling peace, all that happened was peace. Not one terrorist activity, no suicide bombings were happening in the early 1980s. Emergency hospital room visits declined. Traffic accidents declined. Crimes against people declined while they were feeling peace. They weren't trying to make the war stop. They weren't trying to impose their will upon the world outside of them. They were simply feeling that peace in their hearts. This became known as the Maharishi effect. If you've ever studied this, or you can Google it and find out. We know this works. People say, why aren't more people doing it? I think there's so much fear in the world right now. People have lost faith and confidence that we can really do much to make a difference in what's happening in the world. The key is to feel from the outcome as if it's already happened without attachment to the outcome. Feeling as if the healing has already happened without attachment to the healing. That's hard to do sometimes. If you're standing in an emergency room ICU next to your loved one on a gurney, listening to a little heart machine tick away their heartbeats, and you think you're going to lose them in 20 minutes, you've got an attachment to the outcome. You don't want to lose your loved one. I've been in that situation. I'm not saying this is easy to do. I'm saying this is what quantum physicists are finding with regard to how we work in the field, rewriting our reality code. And this is precisely the instructions the ancients left. They said maybe this is what they mean when they say turn it over to God. We've got to let go of our attachment to the outcome. We can still participate without the attachment to precisely what that outcome is all about. Let me share you a story. Some of you have heard this story. A dear friend of mine, the high deserts of northern New Mexico, where we live, in the early 1990s, they were experiencing one of the worst droughts in history. His name was David. And David asked me, he said, Greg, would you like to go with me to pray rain? And he didn't have to ask twice. I said, you bet. And as an Anglo, I had an expectation of what I thought I was going to see some chanting, at least some dancing, some very cool movement. I wasn't prepared for what I saw, because what happened was David took off his old work boots. He stepped into an ancient stone circle. It had been there for so long, he didn't even know whose hands had placed it there originally. And he held his hands in a prayer position like this. He turned his back to me. He honored all of his ancestors. He literally said the words, all of my ancestors are with me now, are with me now. And then he opened his eyes about 20 seconds later, and he looked at me and he says, I'm hungry. You want to go get a bite to eat? And I said, sure. But I said, I thought you were going to pray for rain. And he looked at me and he said, no. He said, if I prayed for rain, rain could never happen. Because the moment I pray for the rain to happen, I am just empowering the fact that it is not here now. And I said, what did you do when you closed your eyes? And he said, I felt the feeling of what it feels like to stand with my naked feet in the mud in our Pueblo village, and the mud's there because there's been so much rain. And he said, I smelled the smells of what it smells like when the rainwater rolls off the earthen walls of our Pueblo village. And I felt the feeling of what it feels like to run with my naked chest through high stands of corn, rubbing against my skin. The corn's so high because there's been so much rain. And he said, I gave thanks of gratitude and appreciation for the rain that already exists. Can you see the subtle, the powerful difference? It's a subtle shift in thinking and feeling. He knew that rain would happen, and it did. By the time we got back up under our property that afternoon, a big black cloud appeared, and something that hadn't happened all summer long. This was August of 90. It started to rain that afternoon. It rained all the rest of the afternoon, into the evening, into the wee hours of the next morning. It rained all the next morning. By early afternoon, there was so much rain, the fields were flooded, cattle were stranded, roads were washed out. And I called David on the phone, and I said, man, this is a mess. I said, what in the world is going on? And he was quiet just for a minute, and he said, that's the part of the prayer that the elders could never really figure out. It's like they could get it started, but they really couldn't regulate it. But I can't prove scientifically that the rain had anything to do with that prayer. I can't prove scientifically that the miraculous healings have anything to do with the feeling that people were feeling inside their bodies, except the correlations are high between when those things happen. Scientists have found that this healing happens in the same brain state that we dream in, because it's in that state where we don't have the attachment to the outcome. Right when we're drifting off to sleep, that's that state where we're not attached to the rightness or the wrongness or the goodness or the badness of what it is that's happening. This is a thermal image of an Asian woman who has an ovarian tumor right here. On this scale, the brighter these colors are, this happens to be a thermal image, the hotter these colors are, and you can see this particular tumor is really warm right here. And what I'd like to show you is a healing that happens in 7 minutes, where this tumor disappears. And that's interesting to me. I know we've seen those before. The next piece is what's really interesting, because I'd like to share with you a brain scan of the person doing the healing that is affecting this. Here's an Asian woman, and this was actually done in a university in Japan, is where these studies were done. They were studying the brain states of the healer while the healing was being affected. So here is when she first begins what's called time 0. 3 minutes into the healing, look at what happens. The tumor is, and the other images actually show it disappearing. The reason it's cooling off here is because it literally is disappearing. 7 minutes later, look at what happens. It's gone. Now that's interesting to me, but what really fascinates me is the brain state. Now what was happening here was that the healer and the woman being healed were separated by a white screen. They never saw one another. There was no conversation. There was no personal contact. There was no interaction. And the person doing the healing had no attachment to the outcome. So this is during the diagnosis phase. And this, for you engineers, this is an FFT, a fast Fourier transform. What they've done is they've taken the electrical activity of her brain, converted it to numbers, converted those numbers into colors, so we can see how active her brain is. You hear about the left and right brain. Look at what's happening. In this state, the left and right brain are very balanced, and they're very low-level activity. She's not doing a lot here. She's feeling. She's not thinking a lot. This is the diagnosis stage. Now, the next images tell the story. Watch what happens to her right brain. Look at this. The left brain stays relatively inactive, but look at this. The right brain begins to become very active, and look at this. It's all happening in the right brain, and the left brain is becoming so inactive it's not even registering on the scale. Look, blue, it only goes down to blue. Look at this. Look at the whites that are happening over here. While she is affecting this healing, what is she doing? She's coming from the place that it's already happened. She is feeling the feeling as if the healing has already happened. Because if we are always working toward our healing or working toward the peace, we're never going to get there. When you look in physics at the way the quantum atom works, and a particle of energy goes from one level to the next, you don't see it gradually going through the space from one level to the next. It makes a jump. 1 minute is here, the next minute it's there. It's called a quantum leap. And it appears that that is the way these experiences work. Coming from the place that's already happened. David was feeling the feeling as if the rain had already happened. The pilot in our story earlier was feeling as if those tires were already there. And I know you've probably had these experiences in your lives before. Coming from the place without attachment, that outcome has already happened. Reality is a code. To rewrite the reality code, we've got to change our beliefs. So how much power do we have to change our world? If there's a field of energy out there and everything comes from that field, and we are able to select and choose what comes from that field and what materializes in our world through the power of our belief, you tell me, how much power do we have to change our world, to change our bodies? I'm going to tell you right now, you have all the power you need to create all the change that you choose. Don't buy in to what you're being shown in the mass media. We don't have to have a big war. We do not have to live in a fear-based world unless we choose to do so. And you are a part of that change that's happening right now. That's why conferences like this are so important. Because it seems that we do better with these kinds of changes when we're supported by others who believe as we do.